Good morning. Good morning. The chat covers up a little bit more of the name than I had hoped, but good morning, everybody. I thought that we could talk about different finds that we have of children that combine both or different species of Homo species that we have. We've talked before in here about Denny, the girl behind me on the screen, but there's others out there. And so today I want to talk about another one that's out there as well. And I thought I'd come in and do so. I know it's not really my typical time, but the whole idea of only having one scheduled live a week is that I can come in on off times and have unscheduled lives. So I thought that this would be a good time to do this. I'll probably only be here for a little while. If you don't know, Sims drops their new thing today, and I love to play Sims. So I'm going to probably play today. Hello, hello. But I wanted to go ahead and kind of go over a couple of different finds. I put some sources for these finds in the website underneath this week. So if you go on to Widda Ord underneath this week, there's a tab or page that says hybrid children. And it has links to Denny and to the Lapedo Child, who we're also going to discuss today. And so if you want more information, that's there. And if you want to follow along some of the different things, that's there as well. I actually didn't know that there were more hybrid children out there. I thought that Denny was the first that we had found. I think that it's more that Denny is the first that we have DNA of. And the DNA itself is, of course, important because the DNA itself tells us more of what's going on and whether or not somebody is actually a hybrid, right? Like whether or not somebody is a hybrid or just is showing characteristics that are different, right? So it can be very important as we're looking at what is actually going on. But DNA and ancient DNA is such a new and recent things. Is it? It might be. Let me look at my internet and see where we're at. Is it still delayed? Sometimes I also think that the way that I speak makes my lips like off, like as the words are coming out of my mouth when I'm looking at cameras sometimes. And just the way that I move my lips. Let me pause it and restart it and see if that'll help. We're doing anthropological discussion in here, Dennis. You're more than welcome to hang around in here. Today we're talking about hybrid children species, or hybrids between two different species, i.e. The one behind me is half Denisovian and half Neanderthal. And the one that we're discussing today as well, the Lapedo Child, is believed to be half Neanderthal and half Homo sapien. So I am an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and I talk about paleoanthropology on here usually. Also talk a lot about ancient Homo sapiens pre about 10,000 years ago as well. Is it better, Sava? Is my verbiage matching my lips again? Chatterman has not been debunked. The article that you think debunked Chatterman actually came out like 2 weeks after the Chatterman article. So it didn't actually have time to debunk the article. Like it didn't actually put any effort into a scientific debunction of the article. And that was like over 10 years ago. And since then, that article has actually scientifically been debunked, meaning that the debunction of Chatterman has been debunked. And I'm not sure what you mean by Chatterman has been debunked. Are you saying like we debunked the existence of Chatterman? Did we debunk the fact that his 300th descendant lives less than a mile from where he is or where he was found? Did we debunk that his group's mitochondrial DNA is the mitochondrial DNA that's across the entire or most of northern Eurasia? It's like 13% of northern Eurasia, West Eurasia, Northwest Eurasia, geographically challenged. So, I mean, I'm not sure what you think we debunked about Cheddarman, but there's nothing that I know of that's actually been debunked about Cheddarman. So, thank you, thank you. This is a recreation based on DNA taken from a bone that's this big, like it's really, really, really tiny. I'm sorry about the delay. And I don't know exactly what the haplogroup is on Cheddarman. I just know that it's related to like 13% of the European population. DNA is not my specialty. I'm not sure how to fix the delay. I could pop it off the internet and see really quick. Let's see if that works. It might be a little bit better along those lines. I know that they've published Cheddarman's mitochondrial haplogroup, but the reason that I don't work with DNA is because DNA is a series of letters and numbers put together in syllabic nonsense. And when something doesn't syllabic in my head, I can't hold on to the word for it, right? So, like, I know and can visualize in my head like R1 to be A3, like stuff like that. But only like one or two of them can I hold on to because we're talking like sometimes it's 20 letters and numbers combined into syllabic nonsense. So it just doesn't hold. Michael, I am so apolitical. It's not even funny. My thought process is burn it all to the fucking ground and no need for government ever. So I am not giving you political bullshit. I actually entered into anthropology and archaeology in part to dismantle the academia system that is so horrific. Okay, so this is not, and we're not talking about Cheddarman. This isn't even Cheddarman. Like you brought Cheddarman into this. We're talking prior to Cheddarman by Denny is 90,000 years old. Cheddarman is 10,000 years old. So we're talking prior to Cheddarman by 80,000 years. Your political agenda came into my non-political educational space. So take your political agenda out of my educational non-political space. Okay? And just because you read it on the internet don't mean nothing. Got to dig a little deeper, honey pie. Got to dig a little deeper. Just saying. Not fucking Cheddarman. Do you see the name on the back of my screen? It says Denny. I don't know why you relate that to Cheddarman. Okay. So anyways, when we're looking at the crossbreeding between species, what we're seeing in the crossbreeding between species. So typically I turn my comments off for a period of time to make it easier for me and everybody else involved. It will turn my comments back on at some period so that people can ask questions. This is not a debate forum. To be a debate forum, you have to have the wit and the knowledge to meet somebody on an equal playing field. Otherwise, it's just you arguing crap that you have no proof for. A. B, this is my box. TikTok gave me a fucking box because I got over 1,000 people. You can have a box too. And if you would like to preach your shit, you can take it to your box, not my box. I choose to use my box to educate people. And the reason that I use my box to educate people is because I don't believe that education should be gate kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall. And I absolutely don't believe it should be gate kept behind language that even people with extensive degrees like I have cannot understand sometimes. And so I try and bring this education into a public forum for free in my box. TikTok gave me this box. Okay. And it's not about your political agenda. It's not about your belief of black and white. Race doesn't exist. Race theory has been debunked. Chatterman hasn't been debunked, but race theory has been debunked. So your idea of race is bullshit. Racism is still here, and it is really effective in almost every government we have, in almost every body we have, in academia, in journalism, in Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse. That racism is ripe right there, isn't it? So it's everywhere. And ethnicity and culture, these are valuable and valued things, and they fall along familial lines, right? They fall along when your grandmother went somewhere, okay? These are beautiful, wonderful things, but race doesn't exist. There's no such thing as race. And the idea that this tells you jack shit about what lies beneath the surface, except for my cultural experiences, is bullshit. Excuse me, Grandcat loves to come in and have a play on my desk. I know, you're fine. Go play. I swear I didn't hurt him. He's just mad at me for taking him out of the area. The idea that this has anything to do with my intelligence, has anything to do with whether or not I feel pain, has anything to do with my ability to be owned, right? Is jack shit. But it still exists, like that thought process. And I'm working hard, just like so many of my siblings, to eradicate that thought process. We don't need to fucking deal with it. And we're not bringing it into here, except to tell you how it's been debunked, which we talk about frequently. Today, we are not talking about Cheddarman. We're not talking about black versus white. We're not bringing in indigenous, which is always left out of the fucking argument, right? Like it's always black versus white. What about indigenous people? But we're not doing that today. What we're doing today is talking about children of two different species. We are all one species, Homo sapiens sapien. We all have a little admixture from everywhere. Myself, I got admixture from everywhere. Not only different species, but everywhere across the globe as a Homo sapien. Turtle Island indigenous. We are not talking about, though, what Homo sapien is today. And we're not talking about how Homo sapien got here so much as we are talking about what different species exist during the Paleolithic and how those different species existing during the Paleolithic not really affect us today, but created the development within our brains that gave us the rise of understanding of self, right? This is one thing we discuss in here often. Your idea that we are innately evil, innately angry, innately violent is wrong. That is something that you've been taught through 10,000 years of studied indoctrination by narcissistic God kings who are doing everything they can to control you. Again, burn the fucker to the ground, right? Who are doing everything they can to control who you are, right? So, using this idea that there are different races, different peoples out here gives them that ability to create that indoctrination and make you believe that you should be angry at your next door neighbor instead of angry at the people trying to kill you, right? So this comes into play, yes, but it only comes into play into the fact that innately Homo sapien is a communal and nurturing creative species. It is not innately biologically mean, cruel, violent. Violence does not come into the scene until so there's always going to be small instances of things in the paleological record that we cannot distinguish what they are. Like we have a spear in somebody's thigh at 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago. Again, dating, And in this spear, we don't know whether or not this spear is because somebody hit them with a spear intentionally, or there was a hunting accident, or they slipped in flint knapping, right? We can't tell how this spear got into this person's thigh. But we do not see violence rise in the paleological record, in the anthropological, archaeological record until 10,000 years ago. And there are extensive studies on this, okay, which we've talked about in here. So when we're looking at people prior to this time, what we're looking at is groups of people who are mixing, who are intermingling, not only with other groups of sapiens that are out there, but with other groups of humans that are out there, because homo means human, i.e., Homo neanderthalis is human, Neanderthal human. Homo denisovian is human, Denisovian. Okay, so we're intermingling, living with, mixing with other species that are out there. This is our history. This is who we are. And this is way more who we are than this violent interaction of trying to kill each other all the time, instead of banding together, taking care of each other, which we're supposed to do. You're not supposed to live isolated in a little box. You're supposed to have a community of several individuals, because no one human being is capable of providing all the things that any singular human being needs in an entire day period of time, let alone providing for themselves and any children involved, right? So we've discussed this in here often when we've discussed prior human species, and we've discussed the early state of Homo sapien. And in this discussion, we've talked about the fact that the Paleolithic shows that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived together side by side in two caves that are a 5-minute walk from each other for 100,000 years, right? In the Levant area. And this is the 100,000 years prior to the 50,000 year ago last common ancestor of all Homo sapiens that are currently outside of Africa, having left the Levant area, with the exception of Australians, because indigenous Australians, the last common ancestor for indigenous Australians and the rest of Homo sapiens leaves Africa around 70,000 years ago. Of course, there are other species in Turtle Island and in Australia before Homo sapien gets to those areas. These are in evidence within the Cerruti Mastodon find and within the Moy Hill site in Australia. The Cerruti Mastodon find is in San Diego in the United States. So with all of this stuff, we understand that as Homo sapien is moving out of Africa, is leaving the Levant area, they are coming in contact with the other humans that have speciated outside of Africa. We've talked before about how Homo erectus is kind of the grandfather of many of these species. Homo neanderthalis, Homo denisovian, Homo florensis, Homo luzonensis. I'm still working on that one. Homo erectus being the grandfather of all of these species, Homo erectus being the first human to leave Africa, the first to actually populate the globe. And Homo erectus makes it clear across the globe. Again, the Cerruti Mastodon find in the Moy Hill site. We see that these things show us that Homo erectus actually makes it clear across the globe. We have absolute evidence that Homo erectus can cross water, and Homo florensis and Homo luzonensis, who are both on islands, both below the Wallace Line. And being below the Wallace Line is a deep, deep trench that has never been above sea level. So they had to cross water to get to these spaces. It's cleared out a bit. I'm going to go ahead and turn comments on a bit. So when we're looking at these different groups of humans across the globe and Homo sapien migrating out, we're seeing that Homo sapien is coming in contact with them. Not only is Homo sapien coming in contact with them, absolutely. Not only is Homo sapien coming in contact with them, but we're seeing that they're coming in contact with each other. We often like to think of hunter-gatherers as, really primitive. And we often like to associate the word tribe with anything that is hunter-gatherer. But the word tribe is a familial group. This is an ancient Latin word, trib, and it means familial group. Band is a group that is separate family groups in a singular unit, a community, right? Pangea ends at 175 million years ago. Like that's the final breakup of Pangea. By 7 million years ago, which is the oldest hominin, right? That's Saleoanthropicus tadici, recently found in Chad, the 7 million-year-old one. There was articles on it. I believe there's links on my site for tadici. Um, by that time, we're looking at like 165 million years, 67 million years between the breakup of Pangea and the start of us. It's believed that the continents were mainly in the space that they're in now. It should, or I always like to make sure that I double down on the understanding that the continents are still moving. Like we're heading into our next what is it called? It's not mega continent, but the word has slipped my mind right now. We're heading into our next Pangea, basically. Um, but what happens is as the movement of the earth, the movement of the tectonic plates, all of that, and I'm not a geographer, geologist, happens, the continents are still shifting. So they're not exactly where they are right now, 7 million years ago, but we're talking like feet difference, right? Not like major stuff, right? So you're looking at by this time, yes, within a few feet. Like I don't want to sit there. Oh yeah, absolutely right, exactly in the same space they are now. So yes, within a few feet, right? But Pangea is definitely completely broken up. We are definitely not one supercontinent. Yes. Well, and there's a lot of things that do, and you'll probably hear my chat as long as it can be open, several different answers to questions that are really, awesome. Because there's tends to be a lot of people in here who know a lot of science that I don't know. I have specific areas of focus, and my brain won't let me. I gather a lot of knowledge, and if I try and gather too much, my brain stops working, right? Because that's just how brains work. But so there's a lot of knowledge that you can hear in here, but so they probably know more than I do. But my understanding is, um, or more about the why. But my knowledge is that roughly in the same area they're in now, within a few feet, right? Same with sea levels. Sea levels have had rise and fall because of the glaciation of the poles, right? Mass glaciation will give you more glaciation, gives you lower sea levels, and less glaciation gives you higher sea levels because we only have a finite amount of water on the planet, right? And if it's all in ice, then the sea levels drop. And if it's out of the ice, the sea levels rise. And this can be some of the flooding myths and things like that. There's not a lot of rapid sea level rise throughout our course of history, especially not throughout the course of humanity. So, we're not looking at a lot of really major rapid sea level rise. We are looking at some change in oceanic, and we are looking at, there are continents and islands, especially in the South Pacific, in that volcanic ring that's still creating islands and disappearing islands today, that have been and gone. uh, a lot of this for the migration pattern has really played a part, right? Because if there's continents that were there, or not continents, but um, islands or larger land masses that were there before that are no longer there, we aren't going to see the evidence on them. And we're not going to be able. This really comes into when we look at the settling of the South Pacific and when we look at the settling of the Turtle Islands, but not so much today. So I don't want to get too sidetracked on it. But oh, we haven't even done. I mean, we know more about space than we know about our own planet. Just saying. Like we've gone further in space than we've gone into our own Earth, and we know more about space than we do about our own oceans, right? So, like, I'm sure they found another something or another. They're always finding another something or another. And let's be real, the egotism within science, uh, the egotism, especially like within my kinds of fields, especially when we're looking at justification for atrocity, the egotism can be so much so that a lot of things that are, are common sense thought processes, like if you really thought about it, makes common sense, are just now being discovered to be real, because they didn't work within the egotism or the need to justify atrocities, right? Um, I think mermaids exist. I think, I believe, I mean, I can believe in anything. I believe mermaids exist. I believe Sasquatch exists. I believe these other things exist. I believe that we've been writing about them in our stories and our legends, actually, right? And I believe that, like, when we look at the Celts settling Ireland and England or Britain, what we're seeing is the tales of like the Furbolg and the Tuatha De Danann are just other species of humans to me. One of the articles that is posted under the Hybrid Children site is the fact that we believe that we were mixing with Denisovians as recently as 15,000 years ago, right? So 15,000 years ago, that's farming's already started. Like Western agriculture has already started at 15,000 years ago, right? Uh, the new tipi, Kuharek tepi, is 12,000 years ago, right? Like 15,000 years ago isn't that long ago, right? So, when we're looking at that, what we have to realize is that we were coexisting with other species for so long. And it's not until the end of that coexistence of other species that we see a rise of violence. It's not until we're the only species left that we see human on human violence, right? And that doesn't mean that there's not small instances. But what it means is that, like, the recent study that I read that worked was looking at this, talked about the fact that in 2000 finds from prior to 10,000 years ago, there's a total of, I think they said 76 injuries. I know that the percentage was like 0.2%, right? Maybe it's 2%. Was 2%. And the fines of violence from 10,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago were like 80%. Right? So from 200,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, there's like 2% of things can be associated to possible human on human violence. Um, from 10,000 years ago to like 5,000 years ago, the presence of absolute human and human violence, mass interment, um, in, like actually seeing like arrows embedded in different body parts, 21 arrows and two bodies in a place that I know of in Egypt. Like, that's huge, right? Almost 300,000 years of time and so little violence. And then 5,000 years and it's 80%, right? So this rise of violence doesn't really come around until after we stop being several different species, right? When we stop being several different species and we are all one species, alongside with the rise of Western agriculture, which dehumanizes the land and turns the land and the biome and the world around you into nothing, something that you can exploit, and the rise of God kings, those in charge using stratification to exploit those down on a lower rung that they've created, right? Um, Jim Cat, I think like so I don't think they've done epigenetics of the ancient finds, right? To be able to tell, like, if I look at my skeleton, I can tell the violence epigenetically of what's gone on, several generations prior to me. Um, so I don't think that they've been able to look at the epigenetics of those that weren't violent deaths to see if they had violence in their history, right? But the act of the violent death, I mean, so if you see a mass interment, you got to assume if a mass interment and they're all of the same genetics, right? Or they're all interred like they all wear the same style clothing, right? Or they all have like the same style pottery or something like that in their interment, though. You're not seeing like pottery buried within something like that. What you're seeing is like a massacre, basically, and then they are throwing goods in with the burial, right? So in things like that, you would see that that there's a specific group that's passed and a specific group that's lived on, but we wouldn't know necessarily what the specific group that lived on was, right? Sometimes you might see where, like, on a layer at 500 years ago, you see a massacre, and then on a layer at 400 years ago, you see a cemetery, right? And in something like that, it would be assumed, or I would assume personally, that the cemetery is from the survivors of those who massacred, right? But it could also be, like if you look at the DNA, sometimes you'll find replacement, right? But sometimes you won't. Like we were talking earlier last week, we were talking last week about the new find about the Gravatian culture, which is like 30,000 years ago, which is actually pre one of the finds that we're going to talk about today, the Lapedo Child. The Gravatian culture uh, comes out and kind of after the end of the last glacial maximum is replacing the prior culture that was in the area. They're using the same tools and the techniques, but they're and with slight differences. But as the farming enters in, the culture that's bringing farming in isn't the same culture that had left before the glaciation had forced them down. It's a new, not this, it is the same culture. It's a new bloodline. It's a new DNA. And again, you have to look at, genetics and DNA, understanding that like that doesn't necessarily, if they've left 2000 years ago, it could be that the original mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA has died out and been replaced with a new mitochondrial Eve. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an absolute replacement. It does show, though, genetic differences. So, we know within that specific space, and it's the Western Gravatian culture. No, it's the Eastern Gravatian culture that we see the replacement in. The Solutrean culture, which replaces the Gravatian culture in the Iberian Peninsula, which is where the Lapedo Child comes from that we're talking about today, is like 23, 24. And they are descendants of the Gravatian culture that was there prior. We know like Cheddarman's direct descendant, 300 generation direct descendant, lives less than a mile from where his bones were found, right? We know that. So we see some spaces where the original population has been able to carry on when we look at the DNA, and we see some spaces of replacement. It's not easy to see in the bones alone whether or not it's a replacement culture. We have to look at the DNA of it, and ancient DNA is only 20 years old. And ancient DNA is still something that you don't always get, right? Like we're never going to get DNA from the Naladi unless we find a perfect preservation, and a very cold, dry environment. Like it's a really deep cave that hasn't got any moisture on it, right? Um, because DNA preserves, so half life is something that all substances have, like all chemicals, all atoms have, is half life. And half life is the rate of time it takes for something to decay by half. And so I'm going to use some really small and large numbers here to make it easier to understand from my explanation, easier for me to give the explanation. If you have 100 strands of DNA in your body and the DNA half life is 1 day, then the first 24 hours after death, you lose 50 strands, half of the DNA that you have. And you start your second 24-hour period with uh 50 strands of DNA, and by the end of that day you lose 25, again half of what you start the time period with. So you can see that by the end of the third day you only have like 12.5 strands of DNA. With DNA, it's not necessarily that the strands disappear, it's that they shrink, right? And DNA is a long repeating chain, basically. And so as it shrinks, you lose the repetitive of the chain, basically. Is my understanding. Again, DNA is not my area of anything, just because though I can understand things like that a little bit better than I can understand the actual DNA because it's syllabics better. Um, so with ancient DNA, the reason that we with ancient DNA, the reason that we have had problems up until 20 years ago and still do have problems is this half-life. 20 years ago, the man who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, Svale Pablo, Sponte Pablo, um, from the Max Planck Institute, developed the polymerase chain reaction. And polymerase chain reaction uses a replication to take uh, DNA strands and replicate them. So if you can get two DNA strands or one DNA strand, you can take that and replicate it millions of times. So now you can test it. The act of acquiring ancient DNA is destructive. So the finger bone that we found our first Denisovian from was just a tiny little tip of a phalange, right? And that had to be ground up, and then you take the ground up bone and you put it in a solution and you put it in like a centrifuge and it spins and it separates the particles so that you can get the DNA out of it, right? So this has destroyed the finger bone to get to the point of being able to process for DNA. And then when you test that strand of DNA, it destroys the strand. So polymerase chain reaction was really needed. You definitely need a few strands to do any test. And if you've only got a couple of strands, you can't even perform one test. But even if you've got like 10 and you can perform one test, still can't perform more tests, right? So polymerase chain reaction creates the ability to replicate the DNA into millions and millions of strands so you can test it. And this advent and this change in technique gave us this ability to go back and test a lot of stuff. But unfortunately, again, we have so much stuff that we just can't get DNA from because of the conditions of its interment. So if it's an extremely cold and an extremely dry environment, like an Arctic environment, you can get DNA for longer. We recently pulled DNA 2 million years old. Like it's not our DNA, it's not human DNA, but like a DNA core sample from. And we recently were able to develop this thing where we can actually text the ground to pull DNA out of the ground, like the soil to pull DNA out of the soil, which is what this core sample did. And so it gives us this idea what the biome looks like. It can tell us what animals and everything were there 2 million years ago. That's our oldest DNA that we found so far. And again, it's not human DNA. Um, but with this changes in structures and knowledge of how to test DNA, we're coming up with all of this new stuff. Um, how we found Denisovian and Denny behind me is there is the Denisova cave in Russia, and it is covered, like just covered with shards. Like it seems to be like some layers seem to be like carnivore predation. Some layers seem to be like just mass bodies. Like it's just covered in shards, and none of them are more than like a couple of inches. Like they're all very small shards, right? Denny's was actually the one of the larger ones, and it was like 2 inches, right? And so when we got the ability to test DNA, we started mass testing these as much as we could, right? And still, starting 20 years ago, we're still processing through so many of these bones. The same thing with pretty much every other find. We're trying to get DNA out of it. And when we can get DNA out of it, then we're trying to process it and understand. There's been a recent invention in the last couple of years that was actually used on Denny, where they take the DNA and they can tell characteristics, physical characteristics, morphology from the DNA. And that's how they were able to render Denny as they were able to render Denny. Um, so it gives us a lot of information. Like the finding of Denny gives us our first absolute knowledge of a true hybrid of a child. So with Denny, what we're seeing is that her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovian. And we can tell this from the DNA. We can see that she has mitochondrial Neanderthal DNA and she has Y DNA from a Denisovian. Yes, the Quay people. Um, it's preferred to use Quay over the San. Oh, I don't know where my little thing is that has the actual spelling on it, just because of the fact that Koshan is a slur. It was given to them by the person that colonized them, and so we try to not use that. But Quay, Kwey, is a good pronunciation for those who can't use the clicks. out loud because I can't click at all. Um, but yes, they are absolutely the oldest population that we know of. They actually are one of two populations in Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA, but they and the other population, the Oyo people of West Africa, have three hybrid, or not hybrid, three other species, ghost species is what we call them, um, uh, within them. So they have three ghost species within them. But when we're looking at the hybridation of two different species, we see that Denny is the first that we have an actual DNA signature of, and so we can actually see what it is. We see with the sorry, we see with the Lapedo Child, and I'm going to go ahead and toss the Lapedo Child actually up behind me really quick. This might pause me as I do this. I don't know. Maybe not. So this is the rendition that we have of the Lapedo Child. Hey! Um, yeah, Trevor Noah's mother's actually so Casa is one of the speaking groups within that group. It's beautiful language. I love the click languages. There's a couple of click languages in Australia indigenous groups as well. Uh, they're also understood to be the oldest languages because of the fact that they're a part of the environment, right? They're languages that signify being a part of the environment, right? That's not the only reason, but that's why I associate them as that. But I know that they've also been able to like linguistically trace them as the oldest languages. Um, but when we're looking at these children, what we're seeing with this is the Lapedo Child. The Lapedo Child was found 20 to 25,000 years old as his burial. He was found in 80 or 98. And I call him he because they call him he. They have not gotten DNA from this child, so we do not know, genetically. And this also is issue with not being able to tell exactly when the mix for him happens. What we see with this child that gives us the indication that we're looking at a mix of Neanderthal and Denisovian. Hold on one second. It does. The eyes are a little too big. Give me just a second to pull this up. And again, all of these are on the Widda Ord site. In fact, there's an embedded page that you can just kind of like scroll through, and it's this page here. This is the jawbone of this child. This top one is the jawbone of this child. This bottom jawbone here is a Neanderthal. That's Homo sapien. I'm sorry, I can tell it's Homo sapien. I think that the thing actually said Neanderthal, and now I have to go and look, but I can tell that it's actually Homo sapien because you can see the chin. And so let me pull it up on the website myself so I can see what it's actually saying on there, so I can make sure that it's saying the right thing, so I can let you know whether or not that's actually. Yeah, okay, so that jawbone is absolutely Homo sapien, the bottom one, I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, okay, it does say that. Behind me. Okay, so this bottom jaw you can see is a Homo sapien jaw, and this top jaw is the jaw of the child. This is the mandible, this is this part of the skull, okay? So in Homo sapien, what we see is that there's a more distinct curve here, okay? And we see this chin prominence, the mental eminence here. It's only in us. It's not in any other species, this mental eminence. And we also see in sapien that our teeth go all the way back, and you can see it on this jaw to the curve of the mandible. The teeth go all the way back. In other Homo species, there's a gap between the back tooth and the back of the jaw. So this curve right here has a gap between it and the molar, like I do since I've had my molars pulled. And in other species, instead of having the straight down or the kind of jutting forward that you see within Homo sapiens and you see within this baby's jawbone, what you're seeing is that it kind of slopes back, right? If you look at the webpage, the Widda Ord page, the two skulls that are facing each other on that page are a sapien and a Neanderthal. And you can see those chin differences in the sapien and the Neanderthal. Though it is a little bit, it's a little bit of a misnomer in the teeth on those two skulls. And I don't know if that's because the sapiens' teeth have been pulled because they show a gap more, and it looks like it's more of a gap. Yeah, they don't have all their molars. It looks like it's more of a gap than the Neanderthal gap on this particular image on the website as I'm looking at it. But, and if I'm counting molars, I'm counting my own molars as I do this. If I'm counting molars on that sapien skull has had teeth pulled, and that's why. But if you're looking at the chin itself, you'll see that the chin on a sapien points out or goes straight down, whereas the chin on a Neanderthal goes back, it slopes back. Okay. So you're looking at the mandible, this top one, the mandible of this child. They call it the Lapedo Child. But the site is Leg Harvella. And it is the first find from that site, and that's why it says Leg Harvelho 1. And I'm probably pronouncing that horrifically, and I apologize. They'll do that. They number, so like this, the grave that's my grave that I study, BJ 581 is BJ because it's Björkö in Sweden, and it's the island of Björkö. And Björkö starts BJ, right? And then it's the 581st grave that was uncovered. So this is the first grave that was uncovered in the Lägervelho site. And the name of this child, because we tend to name our babies and we tend to name half of our finds, is Lapedo. This child was found with a rabbit between its legs, the bones of a rabbit between its legs, vertebra, ribs, and a sacral fragment. There was a reddish color to the rabbit that was identical to the reddish color on the bones. And the thought process is that the rabbit was put in the grave after it was killed. There was also two red deer bones found at the head and the feet. They were both left pelvises and a distal tibia and two tarsal bones. It is also thought that this is a food offering. They think that the rabbit is a food offering, and then they think that the deer is a food offering. I wonder myself if the rabbit was maybe a pet or something that, the child had been associated with. The child itself is about 3.5, so 3.5 to 5 years old by the dentition and by the bone age. They also found jewelry, and this is really cool because, again, this is, as I was saying, this is post-gravation culture. And we were talking the other day about the gravation culture. The gravation culture is the culture that gives us our Venuses. Give me 1 second, and I'm going to show you a picture that we were using the other day. This is, it might take me a second. Hold on. This is going to, there it is. It's like, this is going to top me off. So this is an idea of a headdress that the gravations used. We see this with the Venus that's associated with the gravation people. And again, this is probably going to pause me actually, because I've got to go a little bit further back for this one. You not there? Oh, maybe not. I lied. I thought I had her up. Um, I do have the Venus on the website though. So let me go ahead really quick and I can pull up a picture of the Venus that I'm talking about and show it to you. It's actually under 3/8/23 under this week if you're looking yourself, and it's just halfway down. And you can see this picture of this Venus. This is one of our, it's called the Venus of Brasomte. I'm going to flip my camera so you can see. Now, this headdress has been associated with a couple of different things. There is thought that this headdress is a headdress. There's thought that this headdress is braids, and that it has beads put into it. Now, with the child that we're looking at here, for YouTube, it is on the 320 or 38 page. I can actually pull it up over here and show it to you. It's just, I never know if the camera's showing it right. So this Venus is the one that we were talking about. But it is probably better if you're following along anyways, because there's other things that I don't have the show of on YouTube as easily. So when we're looking at this child, what's found with this child in the burial site are artifacts that look like they are most likely actually artifacts that that look like, I'm sorry, two things at once. These artifacts are similar to the Gravatian artifacts that we're finding. The teeth that you see in the middle here are actually found along the boy's forehead. And so it's thought that this is actually part of that headdress that I was just showing you, which we were talking the other day about the possibility because it's been associated with goddesses, with feminine figurines, if it might have to do with fertility, which actually I think that if it's a small child being buried, like a small child lost, it would make sense that small children, would probably have symbols of fertility that they're carrying with them to kind of keep them whole and healthy. And losing a small child, you would probably send that symbol of whole and health with them, right? You wouldn't want to reuse that. So we're seeing that there is a shell at their neck, which is this top one. And then we're seeing that there are teeth, the canines of deer. Let me double check on that. I want to make sure I'm giving the best information I can. Red deer, 4 pierced red deer canines were fragmented on the skull. And as you can see, they have a deep red color to them. It's thought that ochre was used in this grave as well. There's a lot of deep red within it. The association of the deer canine and the cranial vault is contemporaneous, which means that many burials of the same time period show the same thing in Italy and Moravia. Now, this is found in Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. Again, we're looking at, we were talking about earlier the Gravatian culture, and the Gravatian culture with genetic differences seems to be in two different spaces. We have the Gravatians, well, not two, like, so Gravatians in Italy, and then up further into the main part of Western Eurasia above Italy, and then Gravatians in the Iberian Peninsula and up. These are the precursors to the Solutreans. The Solutreans are something that we've talked about in here before because they're associated with the idea that they had made it to the Turtle Islands, so there's no evidence of that. Again, there's no evidence of that. That's something that's being used to kind of erase people, right? So we've talked about them a little bit in here before about their culture and the fact that we can see their culture carrying down into the current present day population within the Iberia Peninsula. We don't have DNA on this child, as I was stating. So we do not have the knowledge of exactly descendants kind of thing, or exactly the hybridization between this child of parentals, right? So the thought process is, I'm going to pull him back up a bit. The thought process of the Lapedo child, because he's about 25,000 years, is that he is not a direct hybrid of two, that he is a couple of generations down. And the reason being for this is because we firmly still believe that Neanderthals are gone at 30,000 years ago. Now, we're finding new evidence of everything every day. I'm not sure if Neanderthals are gone 30,000 years ago, just like, they're finding evidence that Florensis might still be alive, right? Like, so I'm not sure. And now we're saying that Denisovian was here at 15,000 years ago and intermixing with us 15,000 years ago. So we could absolutely find evidence very soon of this difference, or of them coming down further in the timeline. I'm sorry, my body hurts. So I'm really adjusty right now. With that, what we're seeing with this child, not only is these differences within the body or within this mandible, but we're seeing differences within the body. And what we're seeing within the body is that the lower limbs, or the lower part of their limbs, is shorter. So reflected in the proportions of the tibial length to femoral length. So the tibia is the bigger bone in your lower leg, right? Tibula and tibia and fibula. And in radiography, they taught us your tibia is tough, right? Because it's the larger bone in your lower leg, and so you could tell which one was the larger and which one was smaller. And a little fib. So your tibia is tough. Your tibia is a larger bone in your lower leg, and your femoral femur. Sorry, my Latin sucks some days. Your femoral length versus your tibial length will tell you length of bone, upper limb versus lower limb. That's never fun. My baby at a year and a half broke he's 16 this month, but at a year and a half, he broke both. He had a spiral fracture in his tibia and fibula. And like a year and a half, and I was in x-ray school at the time. Like, I was doing x-rays for a living at the time, and the spiral fracture is like an abuse fracture. And he got it because he was running across the room in these kind of high sandals, and he hit a cord from a vacuum, and I was trying to vacuum. And when he hit it, it twisted him, and he went like that. But I was freaking out. I'm like, oh my God, they're going to think I broke my child's bone on purpose. But he twisted like broke both of them. It was weird. They're not an easy bone to break, but at the same time, an easy bone to break, right? But the differences in the lengths shows us with this child that their lower limbs, not their lower limbs, but the lower portions of all four limbs are shorter in proportion than they would be in an anatomically modern human, or in a modern human at the time, because at the time we're looking at anatomically modern humans, which shows that there is this not quite direct hybridization of two separate species at like mother father, but that there is a line. Like, so this shows that this is the result of a Neanderthal and sapien interbreeding that has passed through many generations, right? So this shows that maybe this person's 30th great grandparents were two different species. And by the time they get to him, he's only getting a few of the Neanderthal traits. So he does have genetically inherited Neanderthal traits again. The mandibular symphysis, which is this back part, and having the bony chin with the Neanderthal synthesis is, or not bony chin, mental eminence with the Neanderthal synthesis is really what creates that almost different look. Like it looks like it's supposed to be, but at the same time, you're like, oh, that's interesting. That we see within the mandible picture here, right? So I love that about this. The other thing that I really loved about this find is the fact that we're looking at a young child that was buried as a young child, right? We're looking at a child that was buried with was buried in a wrap. It's thought that they were wrapped up, not like an infant wrap, but like that they were wrapped up a semi rigid around the body, which would give the ability for them to be buried in the way that they were. So the upper and lower surfaces of the bones were stained. So they think that they were wrapped in a shroud of ochre painted skin, hide, right? But the way that the bones were put in the space, uh, because there's a normal postmortem plantar flexation or downward pointing of the child's feet. And the child is set to where, like, that just, my camera went weird. The child is set to where, like, their bottom is here, but their head is here and their legs is here. So they're like almost in a V, not like, but more like a sitting, like semi laying, semi sitting V, not like, buckled up. And it is supposed from that it's possible that the baby was, or the child was wrapped in something that was a little bit harder. Think probably uh rawhide, right? And rawhide that's painted and coated in ochre. I am not going to be able to stay any longer. I'm so sorry. I wanted to be on here a little bit longer, but my body is not allowing me to. Speaking of which, I will be having surgery at the end of this month, so I will probably be out for the week of the 27th. I will absolutely be here tomorrow at noon, and we'll probably discuss this a little bit more tomorrow at noon as well. And the links are absolutely already on the Widda Ord site. Let me put this back up so you have the Widda Ord site before I go. So you can absolutely find the links to do any of your own research on this if you'd like to. There, just a few links, so you probably want to deep dive. When I Googled it, and when I was able to look through and when I was finding these links, I was able to find the PDFs on this. And so you can take a look at the PDFs on this as well. I can't embed them in the website, but they're easy to find. So you can get a hold of them and take a look at them. But there's a lot of pretty interesting information on it, especially when you're taking a look at it. It not only goes into the child's burial itself, but it goes into the shelter in which it's found in. And there's a lot of stuff on it that's pretty interesting on it. We'll talk about it a little bit more. There is also on the very bottom of that page, our species may have been interbreeding with Denisovians as 15,000 years ago, according to detailed analysis of the DNA of people living in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. So that one's a really interesting article. We'll discuss that a little bit more tomorrow or on Wednesday as well. Tomorrow as well. Have a great day, everybody. I'm sorry I can't stay longer. My body just doesn't work for it today. But I will be here tomorrow, and hopefully my body will work a little bit better tomorrow. And we'll go over a little bit more. Thank you so much for coming in and hanging out, and I'll talk to you later.